Hi everyone, I'm Nikki and welcome back to the Fundamentals of Print Design. In this lesson, I'm going to discuss the typography choices used in our brochure design. We already talked about the color and how to maximize the color use in your print project. So now I'm going to talk to you specifically about font choice. Now, just like with color, I always limit my fonts to 3 or less. Emphasis on the less, but sometimes I realize that you will need a little bit more fonts. The more fonts that you add, the more jumbled everything gets and the less cohesive a design you end up with. So it's really important to stick to 3 fonts or less in your design. So I'm going to talk to you about how to go about picking out your 3 fonts. The first step is to determine the style that you're going for in your document. If you're going for a modern and clean style, such as this, then you would definitely stick to more of your sans serif fonts. For example, here we have chosen a font for our headlines, a sans serif font for the majority of our text, and then we've just used different versions of that font to bring out a text hierarchy in our layout. So it really doesn't matter what your sans serif font is or what your serif font is, but it's just important that the way that it looks represents the theme that you're trying to get in your design. If we were going for a more classic style, maybe something a little bit more old-fashioned, I wouldn't choose a sans serif font. I would choose a serif font for that. Maybe a Times New Roman or an Adobe Carlson Pro, something along those lines. And the point of this is not to get too particular of actual font names, because as designers, it's up to you to use the tools that you have available to you, the fonts that you have available to you. And through that, I will include some links to give you some ideas of where to go for fonts, because that's a whole thing in itself, and you can get into actually purchasing fonts or using free fonts and keeping track of all of that. But as far as font choice goes, you can use what you have available to you on your machine. And just know that as you're choosing your 3 fonts, those 3 fonts need to go together as well. So when we pick out our main headline fonts, these all have a consistent look about them. And then our supplemental text also matches this font as far as style goes. But then we just use a different color to bring it out. We use different sizes in our fonts. We use different thickness, bold versus a lighter font, which you can see here in the title versus the address and contact information for the business. And then another way to create some visual hierarchy in our text is to capitalize certain words over others. Now, clearly, we're not going to all caps everything. You can do that, but as you can see, this is all caps, this is all caps, this is all caps. It's harder to read, and you don't have that visual hierarchy in your text that you want to make things easier for your viewer. So with that in mind, we only want to have maybe the title all caps. And another little trick for you when you're going to have all caps, and I know I didn't do this in the original design, but when you have something all caps, it's a good idea to add some spacing, some tracking to your document of at least 50 in your text. See how it gives some space between all caps? That's really super important. It's a good thing to do if you're going to have a lot of items that are going to be all caps. It makes it easier to read at that final viewing. So with that, you can see that we have our 3 main fonts, and then I always like, if this works, I do not do this for every single project, but if it does work, I love to throw in kind of like a visual detour, I guess we could call it, where you choose a font that totally breaks everything that you already have as far as the majority of your fonts go. So you can see that it's sans serif fonts all throughout. They're all in the same font family. The only way that we've made some visual differences is either by bolding it or making them all caps. Okay, but then for some visual interest, so that it's not all just the same font, I throw in a script or a handwritten font in certain places throughout the document to create a visual interest. And then it takes that modern and chic design and it makes it just a slightly bit more playful, but it doesn't break my original intent at all. But it just creates some more visual interest in my font choice. And you can see that it's not all over the place. We do not have like this whole paragraph in a handwritten font because that would be really hard to read against a dark background, first of all. Plus it'd be hard to read anyway. So we don't do that, but we just use it in the same way that we use that highlight color. We're going to highlight and sprinkle this effect throughout. But the key thing here is that as we are selectively choosing how to place this handwritten font, you can see a pattern in the visual style. We use it here, we duplicate that effect here, and then we use it in all of our headlines as kind of like that last word of the headline, depending on whether there's 3 words or 2 words, whatever. It's the last word of the headline. So even though you're adding some visual interest, you're still keeping to a common theme. You're placing your elements the same throughout, and it just creates a cohesive look to your design, but at the same time, you're creating that visual interest. Because if everything was all the same font, that would be not very interesting at all. Even if you varied the size and the font weight of your text, that would still be dull. So this is a way to spice that up. And like I said, I do not do this for everything, but if I want to add just a little bit extra to my design, that's kind of the first place that I go to and see if it works. And then of course I would change up what this font would be as well. Now on the flip side, if you have a more classic design and you're using a serif font, a script font doesn't work as well as far as contrast goes because they almost compete with each other. So it works better if you have that real sleek, streamlined sans serif font against a more script font. So if you're going to use a serif font and you want to create the same type of thing, I would go for using a serif font and a sans serif together. And I'll just show you really quickly what that looks like. So we can change this to our sans serif font, sorry, and then change this to a serif font really quickly. And then you would have to adjust your size accordingly. See, so you can do something along these lines, but in this case, I would actually not capitalize the serif. All caps works a little bit better on the sans serif fonts, but you can of course play with that. But see, that's another way to create some visual interest in your text if you're not going to go the script route. You want to use a serif and a sans serif font together. I would almost suggest here that we don't use there we go. I like that better. See how a lot of this is just sort of playing around a bit and seeing what looks good. And once you train your eye to see the similarities between these fonts and how they relate, you immediately know if you have the right look or not. That just takes training and practice with the fonts and just using them and seeing what looks good together. I obviously don't settle on a font right away. Sometimes I spend 5 minutes just on this, going back and forth between some fonts that I have in mind until one kind of really stands out. So that is how you can use your fonts and really play with typography in your designs. Remember, again, less is more in this. You want to use 3 fonts or less in your project, and then you can vary how they look by either having difference of capitalization versus bold versus lighter ones, changing up your colors, changing the placement. For example, here we put rotation. Play with rotation. Don't always just stick with straight text. Play with rotation to create some interest. But again, don't overdo it. Always be aware of how everything looks together as a whole, not just separately. All of this text here works together. Our themes are very similar. We have repeating elements throughout, always going back to those design principles whenever we're looking at placing our text, colors, etc. So now that we've talked about color and typography, we're going to move on to image choice in our design. Thanks so much for watching.